3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability uniquely
Without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
What your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Did you know that the first nuclear reactor ever built was located under the football field at the University of Chicago? The Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi led the team that finished construction on the primitive reactor in 1942. Called CP1, short for Chicago Pile 1, it looked much like just that, a pile. Specifically, a pile of graphite blocks and uranium metal with holes drilled to accept control rods that could slow down and stop the nuclear reaction. With this unassuming setup, scientists were able to prove that a nuclear reaction could be sustained and controlled, and they did just that on December 2nd, 1942. On that day, students and Chicagoans on the surface went about their day, unaware that the world had changed under their feet. In the same way, we don't always appreciate the ways that nuclear technology touches our daily lives. Medical imaging like PET scans, MRIs, and X-rays all derive from nuclear. Over 150 of the U.S. Navy vessels that protect our shores are powered by nuclear reactors. The smoke detector in your hallway uses a radioactive isotope to test for the presence of smoke and other particulates. And nuclear energy itself is a clean, safe method of energy production, in which America leads the world. But making sure that nuclear power has a bright future in America is a full-time job. And that full-time job belongs to Jack Spencer, Senior Research Fellow in Energy and Environment here at the Heritage Foundation. Jack Spencer, welcome to Heritage Explains.
Great to be here.
So can you tell us, you haven't been on our show before, so can you tell us who you are and what you do here at Heritage?
I'm Jack Spencer. I've been at the Heritage Foundation since 1998. And I might be the only person, Mark, who's held every position in the research department that exists. Everything from a research assistant all the way up to I was the VP running the economics department for a while. But I'll do neither of those things now. Now I am a research fellow for energy and environment policy. So that area of research is what I have always done. Not always. Since 2007, I've done some aspect of that. Even when I was in management, I was doing, my research area was energy and environment. And nuclear energy is what I focused primarily on. But I touch on everything.
What got you started on nuclear?
Well, when I started at Heritage Foundation, I worked in our foreign policy department, and I was hired as a research assistant to do missile defense. And as time went on, I became responsible for there were only two of us back then, Mark, who did national security issues. And I was one of them, and my portfolio included things like nuclear weapons, submarines, things like that. And though I loved the Heritage Foundation, as demonstrated by my coming back, being a young professional, I was ready to move on to do something else. And so I went and worked for a company called BWXT in their Washington office. And I worked on, they did military nuclear stuff, but they also did commercial nuclear stuff. So I went and worked in their Washington office because of my policy background in submarines and things like that. But what I ended up working on was commercial nuclear energy issues. So I did that for them for 2 years. And it became apparent to me fairly quickly that, well, in 2 years, it became about a year and a half, it became apparent. But within 2 years, the point is, the corporate life was not my thing. Despite my insistence on wearing a tie every day, I don't like the structure of corporate life. I like the freedom of a think tank, and especially the Heritage Foundation. And Heritage happened to be looking for someone who did nuclear energy and believed in free enterprise. And if you're going to compete for a job, I recommend that be what you compete for, because there's no one like that. there was just me who believed in nuclear energy and free enterprise. So I came back to Heritage, and I have been doing some iteration of that ever since.
So now we are in a new presidential administration. This presidential administration, obviously, as we well know, has some different views on various topics, including nuclear energy, as compared to the last presidential administration. There have been a number of executive orders. Can you tell us about the Trump administration's posture toward nuclear power and some of these EOs that have come out?
Yeah. Here's the thing. President Trump is unique in a lot of different ways. One of them, however, is on his support of nuclear energy. Biden supported nuclear. Support of nuclear energy is not new per se. As far as Clinton supported nuclear energy. Both Bushes certainly supported it. So it's not his support of nuclear energy that's different. But here's what is different. It's how he's going about doing it. One of the things that I have as a nuclear energy person have critiqued past efforts and current ones, we might talk about this, what's going on Capitol Hill, efforts to support nuclear energy to move the technology forward, is that it relied largely on subsidies, some sort of taxpayer support, whether it's direct payment or direct payments, tax credits, this demonstration program, that demonstration program. It all relied on taxpayer support. My critique of that approach was subsidies never work if what you want is an economically sustainable industry. But more importantly, or as importantly, is that the problem with relying on subsidies is that it detracts from the incentive to address the underlying issues that gave rise to the need for the subsidies to begin with. And so as I saw this enthusiasm growing around nuclear energy in the last couple of years, I wanted to, I've built a career on this idea of we need to do something other than subsidies. And so I wrote a book, Nuclear Revolution, on this issue. And in that book, I make the argument that if we want to do nuclear differently, if we want a different outcome, if we want to build more nuclear reactors, we need to not have just these policy reforms on the margins. We need truly a revolution in how we do nuclear energy policy. That's a long-winded way of saying, I recognize. That's what Trump just gave us with these executive orders. Trump's executive orders very much give us the opportunity to revolutionize how we do nuclear energy. They're just executive orders, which can be reversed. But what they do is lay the predicate for long-term change that allows us to build a nuclear energy policy and a framework or the structures of regulation that recognize a number of things. One, we've been safely operating nuclear power plants in this country for 70 years. They're not new. It's not a new, scary technology. So often when people talk about nuclear or think about nuclear, they think as if it's this new, scary thing. It's neither new nor scary. It's well understood. It's not a nascent technology. It's a mature technology. That doesn't mean that there aren't new nuclear plant designs and things, but the basic technology is well understood, and we should treat it as such. The industry is well understood. It's established. Our understanding of the threat of, or the alleged threat of, low-dose radiation is different today than it was 70 years ago or 50 years ago when these regulations were, when the trajectory of today's regulatory structures were put in place. The United States once was the global leader, bar none, in commercial nuclear energy. We supplied everything for everyone, basically. That's no longer the case. So these are all realities that these executive orders recognize and give us an opportunity to redo. And so that's the promise. So what I would argue Trump's executive orders do, in large part, is says, I have a lot of confidence in nuclear energy. Let's move away all the underbrush and let's let it go forward and be successful. It does some other stuff too that I don't love, but I'm less worried about that because and I'm happy to discuss that because it lays the foundation for real change and asks the real questions that need to be answered in order to do nuclear differently.
Can you give us some examples of some of these executive orders?
I'll give you the biggest one, the one that's a complete game changer, potentially. It's this idea of the linear no threshold model, LNT. What LNT is the model used as the basis for protecting against low-dose radiation. And what LNT supposes or tells us is that any exposure to any low-dose radiation increases your risk of cancer. That exists within the context of something called a LARA, which is as low as reasonably achievable. So within the way we do nuclear regulation, you need to, from a technological standpoint and engineering standpoint, you need to make your technology as it relates to low-dose radiation exposure as low as reasonably achievable. What that does is, that's the underlying assumption of all of our nuclear regulation. Here's the problem. LNT has never had been based on anything. There's never been a strong scientific basis for the linear no threshold model. And as time has gone on and more research has been done, it's been demonstrated to be not the appropriate way to look at low-dose radiation or to protect against it. We are being bombarded, all of us, every day by low-dose radiation. There are places around the world where we have natural experiments where people are exposed to far higher levels of low-dose radiation than anyone ever would be at a nuclear power plant. And what we see is that there's literally zero impact on cancer prevalence. In some cases, there's even less cancer there than in the broader population. The LNT model just is not tethered in real science. So here's what I've argued is that I'm not saying we shouldn't protect against low-dose radiation. Our regulations should reflect the actual risks posed by low-dose radiation. If you talk to most people in the nuclear industry, not just power plants, but scientists and research labs, they will tell you this about LNT. However, people didn't talk about it in policy circles. It was sort of looked at as fringy, or you could never get it done. So why even talk about it? No one wants to talk about radiation until, I'm not saying anyone read my book, but in my book, I laid out all this out. And, but that's just one dumb little book until a couple of weeks or a week ago, President Trump issued this executive memorandum where he says the LNT model and ALARA are inappropriate, and we're going to review all that and make changes as appropriate. If they do that, that begins to fundamentally change the economics of nuclear power, because it fundamentally changes how you regulate against low-dose radiation, which is one of the highest cost drivers in developing and building nuclear power plants. Completely changes everything. Potentially, it's all potential. I'll give you another one real quick. One of the critiques that people often give of President Trump is he's isolationist, he's protection, all these things. Apparently not when it comes to nuclear energy, because one of the things that these executive orders does is puts a bright light on the importance of commercial trade with our friends and allies. And it basically says, look, there's too much bureaucracy that hinders this very important trade. And when, we often hear, in energy discussions, especially with nuclear energy, there's all this enthusiasm, not just in the United States, but around the world about nuclear energy. And that enthusiasm comes from a lot of different countries. And as it stands now, the country's best positioned to supply that demand that's out there is Russia. Russia's been probably the global leader in commercial nuclear technology exports over the last couple of decades. And you have China that's nipping at their heels. No one has built more reactors in the last 10 years or so than China. And they're now beginning to really engage in the export world. If we have any chance at all to compete with the Russians and Chinese, we're not going to be able to do it alone. We need to do it with our friends and allies who all of us separately have challenges in nuclear energy. But together, especially if with some regulatory relief, us and the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Canadians and the British, that begins to build a team not on a country by country basis, but for firms to be able to put together consortiums and that sort of thing. Then you can start competing with the Russians and Chinese. And the EOs acknowledge that. And that's another really important piece of it.
You obviously are not a subsidy guy. Something we hear a lot about with energy or what so-called alternative energy sources is that, well, they need these subsidies from the government in order to survive. One of the benefits of nuclear power is that they would not require these government subsidies. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. A lot of people on Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle, want to subsidize nuclear energy. It's one of the big controversial issues holding up the spending bill, the reconciliation bill right now is, you have the Inflation Reduction Act that put in place all kinds of subsidies for nuclear and wind and solar and all kinds of stuff. And, interestingly, no Republicans voted for that. But now that it's been in place for a couple of years, it has more bipartisan support than I wish it did. So anyway, there is this question about nuclear energy and subsidies, or energy and subsidies in general. And look, people say they don't like DEI. I would argue that this is essentially DEI energy policy that's being promoted here. Whether you're talking air traffic control towers or energy markets, if you are using the power of government to push something forward on considerations other than merit, no matter what the potential of that underlying thing is, whether that's a person or an energy source, I would argue, you're not going to get the best out of either when you subsidize those things, when you use the power of government to push it forward on something other than merit. That's exactly what's happening with energy policy. Has been for a long time, for a couple of, for certainly a decade. It's been increasing. It came to a crescendo with the Inflation Reduction Act. And now we have a chance to end DEI energy policy. And my fear is that people aren't doing it. Why it's important for nuclear is this. We've tried subsidizing nuclear before. The people may remember the term nuclear renaissance. We had all this enthusiasm around nuclear in the mid-2000s. And you had lots of government subsidies coming in to push it forward. That brought in behind it lots of private investment, just as the central planners planned. What happened, though, is that the nuclear renaissance, for a number of reasons, never took off. And the whole thing collapsed because the private investment was not based on market fundamentals. It was based on assumptions that were driven by government policy and subsidies. And it set the whole industry back. It also prevents people from asking, why do we need the subsidies to begin with? We're at a similar point in time right now. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of real market-driven enthusiasm around nuclear. And we have, in addition to that, these executive orders that allow us to answer the underlying question. So my plea to people who want to see nuclear energy be successful is, let's not focus on the subsidies. Let's focus on making nuclear energy as competitive as it possibly can be, given that we have this new environment that the president's executive orders are creating. Let's make that work better so you don't need the subsidies to move forward, which the subsidies will not last forever, and then when they're gone, you will fail. Let's use these executive orders to get a regulatory and economic environment that allows the industry to be successful over time, not dependent on the fleeting nature of politicians, which is exactly what you're creating when you depend on subsidies. And this notion that we often get that, we'll sunset them in a couple of years. We just need it to kickstart. I'm not saying anyone's lying, though some people may be lying. I'm using the word lie as shorthand for it. There's something untruthful about it because of this. We see it time and again. Whenever you put sunsets on subsidies, everyone's like, we're going to get rid of them in 3 years. Then when 3 years comes around, everyone says, now I got 1,000 jobs dependent on these subsidies. We need to extend them for 3 more years. And they become permanent. That's what happens all the time. In fact, a lot of the subsidies in the IRA that people act like they were Biden's thing, these are subsidies that began under the second Bush administration in the Energy Policy Act. And this IRA subsidies are just evolutions of that. We need to stop doing that. We need to stop doing that and focus on the underlying policy that will allow things to be successful in their own right.
So looking kind of down the road and around the corner with these EOs in place, do you think that we may be on the cusp of a nuclear revolution?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we need to get rid of the subsidies. I don't mean to harp on it, But I'm confident that so long as the subsidies are in place, people will pay more attention to extending them than to taking full advantage of the opportunity that the EOs provide. But let's just focus on the EOs. The EOs, they give us a chance to redo regulations. So the way I look at it, the EOs don't, some people have criticized the EOs as saying they're undermining this and they're getting rid of they're not getting rid of anything. What they're doing is think of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as a house that was built in the mid-1970s, and it's been added onto in layers and layers over the years. What Trump did is not burn the house down. He took it down to the studs, and now he's going to rebuild it. He gives us the potential to rebuild it with modern, to modernize it with modern knowledge and whatever. And so we have the potential to fix regulation. Nuclear, we haven't touched on nuclear waste, but our system for managing nuclear waste is completely non-existent. Like the federal government has completely screwed that up. The EOs give us an opportunity to get that right. We'll see how that turns out. I think that's critical, but we have an opportunity to do that differently. The way we fuel our reactors has been completely messed up through decades of bad policy. Gives us a chance to fix that. So we have regulation, waste, fuel, and the international commerce piece of it. It gives us a chance to fix that. Like all of those things are addressed specifically in the EOs in a way that recognizes the flaws of the current system and opens the door to doing it better. And then it does other things that are important, I guess, and may be helpful, but there are things like making it easier to build a demonstration reactor on federal land at national labs and things like that. Those things can be helpful if they're properly administered. And I'm not saying that the Trump team will or will not properly administer them, but these types of programs can easily morph into expensive government-run programs. They can easily morph into proxies. Because our system of regulation is so onerous, one of the ways to get around that in the past that people have talked about is let's just build them on DOE property or on DOD property, and then we can do it under a different regulatory environment. That may or may not be the case, but what that ends up being is a proxy for fixing the underlying issues. And much like the subsidies, I'm skeptical of doing things that are proxies for doing the hard work of fixing the underlying issues. And so I think that if there is a good reason to advance a national interest or a national security interest to build on a DOD or DOE facility, then the EOs make that way easier, and I'm all for it. What I'm not for is saying what we really need is a nuclear reactor to power this, tech firm's data center, and it's too hard to do it in the private sector, so we're going to build it on a government site. I don't like that kind of thing. And that's not what this calls for. The EOs don't call for that per se, but what my point is that the EOs, that dynamic could morph out of the EOs, and we need to be careful of that sort of thing.
In the event that we do achieve a nuclear revolution and nuclear energy is kind of unleashed in the United States, what are you excited for about that future?
Yeah, I'll tell you. It's why I've dedicated a career to it. It gives us guaranteed, reliable, clean energy for a long, long time. Like there's just no other energy source like it. And I like coal and natural gas and hydrocarbons and whatever, but nothing provides clean, affordable, reliable energy like nuclear energy does, like nuclear power does. But it's not just about the electricity that it provides. Nuclear, one of the great things about nuclear, I don't know that people generally understand, is how adaptable it is to any power needs. So if you are a petrochemical industry or a fertilizer industry, or anyway, these are sectors that require a lot of heat, high quality heat to do their industrial process. Nuclear can provide that. Desalinization, nuclear can provide that. Electricity, obviously. Just like anything that you need power for, nuclear can do it. And it does it literally without any environmental seepage. There's nuclear waste, but nuclear waste is not despite, 50 years of cultural narrative that it's the worst thing in the world. It's not. Like literally, Mark, if you were able to use nuclear energy for all your energy needs for your entire life, you would produce about a Coke can's worth of nuclear waste.
Wow.
Like that's not, if you took all the nuclear waste that we've produced in this country since the dawn of the commercial nuclear era, it would all fit on a single football field, 3 or 4 or 5 yards high. So it's, and it's not sludge. People, for all that the Simpsons have done for society, and it's far more good than bad. They gave us this impression, or they amplify this impression that nuclear waste is like this sludgy stuff. It's not sludge. It's literally a piece of ceramic. Now as you put it through processes, you can create some liquid and stuff like that. But all of that is controllable. So anyway, nuclear waste just isn't a big deal. That's why I'm excited about it. And it can be extraordinarily affordable. Right now, it's not as affordable as it could be because of the things we talked about. It's operating under a regulatory environment that artificially inflates the cost. Here's a quick thing. When we first started building nuclear power plants, we built them we built them for about anywhere from, around a quarter of what they cost now. They took about a third of the time is what they cost now. So we know that we can do that. And, going back to the subsidy thing, a lot of people use to justify subsidies. Well, we need to build an industrial base. We don't have an industrial base yet. We need the workforce. We don't have that yet. We just need some help. Mark, we built the first one ever in just a couple of years and not for $13 billion. Now, there was government help, but my point is that we went from zero to building reactors in a couple of years. The first reactor ever built that ever produced electricity, not commercially, but just produced electricity, took 2 years to build. The first commercial nuclear power plant ever built was it took literally 4 years to build and start producing electricity. So this stuff, it's not about subsidies. It's just not about subsidies. There's tremendous risk in building a nuclear power plant, not because of the underlying technology, not because our industry doesn't know how to build and operate a nuclear power plant, because the politicians have created this system that no one can invest money in without getting government skin in the game because it's so unpredictable. And coming back to what we were talking about, the Trump EOs give us a chance to do it differently.
Jack Spencer, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Now, Mark, you forgot to ask me one other question.
I did forget to ask you a question. It's a very important question. And that question is that if you have not had enough of this conversation, there's a whole lot more, because you can check out the Power Hour, which is one of our podcasts here at the Heritage Foundation, hosted by yourself, Jack Spencer. Tell us a little bit about the podcast and where folks can find it.
Yeah, the Power Hour is the podcast that I host where we do a weekly podcast, and you can find it on the Heritage feed under the Power Hour. Now, here's why you should listen to the Heritage Foundation Power Hour, Mark. This is going to sound like I'm being hyperbolic, but I assure you, hyperbole is not something I traffic in. I only traffic in the truth. And the truth is, we get the best people in energy and environment in the world on this podcast. We get CEOs. We get top government officials. We get entrepreneurs, not piddly entrepreneurs who's out on the street corner trying to hustle a nickel, the real deal people with millions of dollars who are out there trying to make things happen and build stuff. The presidents of organizations, we get them all. It's the best. I'm telling you, it's the best energy and environment podcast out there. That I guarantee. And plus you get more of me. So despite that, it's still worth checking out because of the great guests we get.
Well, Jack, everybody, we encourage our Heritage Explains audience to check it out. Jack Spencer, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Thank you to Jack Spencer for his contribution to today's episode. There are links to both Jack's book, Nuclear Revolution, Powering the Next Generation, and to the Power Hour podcast in the show notes. Thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Guiney, Lauren Evans, and John Pop.